think anyone who is genuinely concerned, as I am, of the fate of ordinary innocent Palestinians in the Gaza Strip should be advocating for the proper enforcement of international law and, for example, the obligation that Egypt has under the African Union Convention on Refugees, which it acceded to in 1980, the responsibility it has to facilitate the passage of genuine refugees under the definition of that convention, any individuals fleeing civil disorder. Um, Applying the proper international law that Egypt has signed up to Egypt in this instance would facilitate the evacuation of Palestinian civilians, the provision of humanitarian assistance on the other side of the Gaza border in the Sinai, in Egyptian Rafah, so that aid isn't diverted to Hamas. There are very simple, straightforward measures that can be taken that should have been taken in October of last year for the protection of Palestinian civilians. But they weren't taken. And what the situation that has developed is very simply that Israel has undertaken the responsibility of protecting Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip, protecting them also from Hamas attacks, because they have been shooting Palestinian civilians that have sought to flee because Hamas so desperately wants to hang on to its human shields. And the very core of this needs to be understood. This is Hamas's aim, to seek to generate Palestinian civilian casualties, which Israel has been doing its utmost to prevent, and to do so in order to generate international pressure on Israel, because that is Hamas's only hope of survival, to generate both the factual misstatements and false allegations, but also those in international law, to generate pressure on Israel to cease its lawful self-defense against Hamas so that Hamas can survive this operation, this war, which has been called Iron Swords. And that spells disaster, not just for Israel, but for all Western liberal democratic interests around the world. Because, of course, we need to understand that what starts with Israel in this respect is not intended to end with Israel. The aims of these Islamist fundamentalist groups, sponsored by Iran, have been made very clear.
All the charities that are working in Gaza, the organizations that are helping the civilians there, they say it's not enough. They say people are dying there, they're starving there, and Israel is using starvation as a weapon in the war. What would be your answer to that?
It's unfortunate that these aid organizations seem to be seeking to cover up their own failings by blaming Israel. It is, again, a matter of public record that the capacity that Israel has just across the two crossings, the Kerem Shalom crossing and the Nitzana crossing, the capacity that Israel has to check aid, to make sure that there are not weapons being smuggled through, to make sure that there are not items that Hamas will use for its terror initiative. Israel's capacity to check aid stands at some 44 lorries of aid an hour. That is significantly in excess of what the international community is putting through. And we do also have repeated daily updates from COGAT as to the amount of aid that is piling up on the other side, so inside Gaza, after Israeli checks, that has yet to be distributed by UN organizations and other humanitarian organizations on the ground. Now, we understand the difficulties, the practical difficulties associated with the distribution of that aid. Hamas is diverting it. There are other criminal gangs that have been also, it seems, stealing aid. The ability of UN and other humanitarian organizations to distribute it in the context of a war zone where there is still intense fighting between Hamas and the IDF taking place is clearly extremely problematic.
Let's talk about the casualty figures in Gaza. We see them every day on the news that now more than 32,000 Palestinians were killed. 70% of them are women and children, and the number of children is estimated as around 13,000. These numbers are enormous. So how reliable are they?
They are not reliable. There has already been substantial analysis just on the figures themselves and the uniform fashion in which they have been increased by Hamas on a daily basis. It's critical to understand that these are figures put out by the Hamas terror organization. The idea that the international media would take figures put out by Al Qaeda or ISIS as having any credibility to them is simply not workable, and yet we see them reporting these figures mostly without qualification. The other aspects of the unreliability of these figures are that they make no distinction between civilians and combatants. So neither in their fighting in life nor in death, unfortunately, do Hamas distinguish between the terrorist fighters and civilian casualties. We also don't know how these people are said to have died. Quite apart from the analysis of the naturally occurring deaths quite outside of the conflict situation that we're seeing, we also have evidence that has been accepted by the Americans also of Hamas targeting its own civilians, shooting fleeing Palestinian civilians, bombing fleeing civilian convoys, those civilians seeking to follow the instructions of the Israeli Defense Forces and evacuate areas where there will be intense fighting because of the Hamas terror infrastructure. And we have also seen Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets that were fired with the intention of killing Israeli civilians, in fact, falling short in the Gaza Strip and killing Palestinian civilians indiscriminately there. So when one takes all of these factors into consideration, no, one cannot trust the numbers, especially in the absence of that context. But even if you were to put all of that aside and compare the Israeli record of civilian to combatant casualty numbers, and even based on the Hamas figures against the some 15,000 terrorists that Israel has identified that it has killed, then we're looking at a civilian to combatant ratio. It's terrible to reduce it to ratios and numbers of this sort, but in the context of armed conflict, this is the only way that one can have any sense of comparison. So the ratio that the Prime Minister put out was that it was less than 1 to 1. Other analysis suggests 1.6 or 1.5 to 1, 1.5 civilians to every one combatant. That sounds terrible, but when one compares it with the global average that the United Nations puts out, which is 9 civilians to every one combatant, and when one compares it with the averages of the Allied forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, which is between 3 to 1 and 5 to 1, then a 1 to 1 average is completely unprecedented. And in the context of the intense fighting and the urban armed conflict and Hamas's terror infrastructure, which is embedded in civilian areas and uses civilians as human shields, it is quite remarkable that Israel has been able to achieve such a low casualty ratio amongst civilians. And it is testament to the extraordinary measures, the unprecedented measures that Israel takes to prevent civilian casualties.
So this proportionality, why do you think then, if you describe it like this, like the ratio 5 civilians to 1 fighter, and that ratio in this conflict is much lower, 1 to 1, so why is there such a focus on what Israel is doing, and why are the accusations there that Israel is being disproportional in their reaction?
Well, it's really important to understand that the assessment of proportionality is not on the basis of comparing casualty figures at all. And that is another major misrepresentation, especially in the way that this conflict is being covered by the international media. That would be macabre and reprehensible, and it would also simply encourage Hamas to keep trying to drive up the number of civilian casualties that it is inflicting on the civilians in the Gaza Strip. International law does not work on the basis of an effects-based analysis. It is based on intention. So it is completely inappropriate to suggest that a comparison of the casualty figures assists with an assessment of proportionality. Proportionality under the law of armed conflict is about the intention of the military commanders making an assessment and weighing up the military advantage of any particular strike against the anticipated civilian collateral damage. Now, it's critical to understand in that context, the law of armed conflict anticipates and accepts that there will inevitably be collateral damage in the context of fighting an enemy. That's even before you get to the scenario in which Hamas is using this in terms of driving up civilian casualties as a tactic of its own warfare. But in that context, Israel has a track record not just of applying the law of armed conflict and proportionality in particular, but going way above the requirements of international humanitarian law. And the assessment that it conducts on a strike-by-strike basis, where these targets are approved in advance by military lawyers, and where every single army commander has the responsibility to ensure that the IDF code of ethics of preventing civilian casualties, of prizing life, giving it the highest value, that every IDF commander is in a position to call off a strike if there are civilians in the vicinity, and if that proportionality analysis becomes disproportionate in their opinion.
Yeah, we're almost coming to a conclusion. So my question is, Israel is being brought before the International Court of Justice. Why not Hamas?
Well, Hamas is not a state, and they are simply not held, unfortunately, to international law. That is why their very modus operandi is to break every aspect of the law of armed conflict and international law in their fight to eradicate the state of Israel. The reason that Israel has been brought before the International Court of Justice is, in fact, a technical one. And that is why South Africa advanced this false, malicious allegation of genocide. It provides a hook to bring Israel to the court because Israel is a signatory to the Convention on the Prevention and the Punishment of Genocide. And that is the true motivation for the allegation. Well, I would say that there are two parts to it. Part one is the technical hook that it has afforded South Africa to actually bring this case. But the other aspect of this is the propaganda factor. The allegation of genocide is so heinous, and it is the only real way in which to understand it is in the context of this ancient blood libel, which accused Christians of Jews of killing Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals. The allegation of Israel intentionally killing civilians and seeking to commit genocide is just as fallacious. And it has certainly changed the debate and changed the manner of in which reasonable people, it seems, are able to discuss the important developments that are happening in Gaza. And it has assisted Hamas in weaponizing international law and misrepresenting it and abusing it vis-a-vis Israel to seek to win. And it wins very simply by surviving. If Israel is not able to destroy Hamas and to prevent it from ever seeking to commit the 7th of October again, and critically to free the hostages, 134 of them are still being kept by Hamas, then Hamas will have won. And that spells, as I indicated earlier, very bad news, not just for Israel, but also for the interests in the West that Hamas and other Iranian proxies are seeking to do harm to.
Yeah, because what could the international community, according to you, what could they do to put pressure on Hamas to release the hostages that are still in Gaza?
I think they could be doing an awful lot more, not least because Qatar clearly has leverage over the Hamas leadership. And so these diplomatic games that have been played with people's lives at stake are pretty despicable. But clearly the international community can be doing more to support Israel, an ally of the West that is fighting the fight of the West in the Middle East, and by certainly not giving credence to the false allegations and the misrepresentations of international law that are being used to seek to delegitimize Israel and to seek to stop it from being able to exercise its rights of self-defense.